Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Sarah Reilly, and I'm the CEO and founder of Cred Consulting, and I'm welcoming you all today to our webinar, which is part of our Cred's free Creducation series, where we join our colleagues and friends to share knowledge and ideas with our industry to work toward a more connected, healthy, and happy world. Before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands on which we all gather today and pay my respects to elders past and present. I'd also like to acknowledge any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander participants with us today. I'm joining from Gadigal land today in Sydney, Surrey Hills, so welcome. Okay, everybody. So today we're talking about getting the public open space people need. A topic I'm sure everyone here is as passionate about as me, and one for which there are many different views and opinions. The research is clear that public open space is critically important for us all and packs a massive value creation punch. Phoebe, someone's raised their hand. Delivering social, economic, cultural, and environmental benefits for the people who use it and the communities it creates. For the property owners whose buildings go up in value, to the developers whose places are more desirable to buyers, to the government agencies whose service delivery costs decline through improved physical and mental health and safety and security outcomes. We know that there are so many competing priorities for limited appropriate land and limited funding and resources. And over time, the push to deliver housing with the intent of more housing affordability has made it harder and kind of more acceptable to reduce the provision of open space, both in hierarchy and size and quality, or just drop it off the plan altogether. While we all know public open space is critical infrastructure and state and local governments have clear plans and strategy for its delivery, too often when trying to plan for new parks, sports fields and other recreational spaces, we're hearing that land is just too high value for public open space. Or there's plenty of open space in the suburb next door, or that's somebody else's problem. Or the planned open space just doesn't get delivered and 5,000 people have already moved in. Or the open space planned is relegated to small leftover pieces of land poorly located and flood prone and with huge future maintenance burdens to councils. So what can we all do? How can we take this important challenge and collectively make changes? From small ones on sites to big ones that take leadership, bravery and industry collaboration. How can we drive values-based value creation through our planning system for all involved? From the landowner to the developer, to the people living in our communities and places, and to the government agencies who deliver increasingly costly social and health services. Let's find out. Today, I'm really happy to be joined by my friends and colleagues with over 50 years of experience between us. That's a lot of years. Abinaya Rajavelu is our director at Cred Consulting. Hi, Abby. Abby is one of the leading thinkers in Australia on open space planning and how we should evolve them to cater to our changing and evolving community. She draws on her experiences from across the globe, including from India, the US, France, Netherlands, and Australia. Esther Cheong, the director of Atlas Economics, is known very widely for advocating for smart decisions on land use and development. She brings a deep understanding of the various phases of land use and infrastructure planning, and with over 20 years driving success in this space in Australia and overseas, Esther has the depth of knowledge to provide early inputs to planning to get good outcomes, really practical, sensible outcomes for everybody. Greg New is somebody who needs no introduction and has been a friend and colleague of Cred's for a very long time. A specialist and consultant at GLN, is an expert in land use, infrastructure and development contributions planning. His 30-year career stretches across both government and the private sector, and as we all know, he's the guru on all things contributions. So just to get us started, a few housekeeping things. This is in the first part of today's webinar, we'll be hearing from our panel. Then we'll have 15 minutes for Q&A. And I think the Q&A today will be pretty spicy, and we're really looking forward to some of the questions that you guys pose and being able to answer them for you. We really love to hear your questions. So throughout the webinar, I encourage you to submit your questions through the Q&A button on the Zoom toolbar. If you have any problems, just chuck them in the chat and we'll also see them there, and we'll make sure that we bring up some of the more interesting ones. You can do this throughout the session and we'll come to your questions at the end. Just to note, today's session is being recorded and we will send you the recording afterward. It will be on our website, but you'll get a personally emailed to you through your email address. Okay, so that's it from me. Now over to our first speaker. Over to you, Abby.
Thank you, Sarah. And just echoing what Sarah just said, public open space is essential infrastructure for our community. And when we say public open space, they include a whole range of spaces from, parks, natural areas, linkages, foreshores, spaces for active recreation like sports grounds and courts, play spaces, recreational trails, loops and links for walking, play, and cycling, and a whole range of outdoor recreation facilities that offer our communities spaces to gather, play, recreate, and spend time together in. Thanks, Phoebes. And to Sarah's point also earlier, there's many well-established and well-researched benefits of open spaces that we've known for a very long time. I mean, even though it's been well-established, every time we talk about open spaces in many planning projects, what comes up either at the outset, during later stages of planning, or during delivery is the cost of open space, the cost of delivering the open space. But what we don't talk about is the cost of not providing them, and those costs are pretty significant. So we're going to talk about a few of those costs that can be saved in the long term. For example, more Australians live in apartments now, and as this trend is on the rise, we will need more outdoor spaces as third living and breathing spaces. This means in our urban densifying areas, we need more outdoor spaces, not less outdoor spaces. At the same time, obesity and long-term health conditions are also increasing in Australia. Annually, Australia spends about, I think, $172 billion, $1 billion, 172, not million, don't get me wrong, on chronic conditions like heart disease, cancer, mental health, driving much of this cost. And think about how much money we can save if we actually enable active living. And other research found that in the US, per person, $1,500 you can save a year on healthcare expenses if you facilitate active living. So there's a lot of unit costs that can be saved if we provide open spaces at the get-go or at the beginning. The other really big indicator is social cohesion is at its lowest now in Australia and is showing very active signs of it continually declining into the future. Parks and open spaces can be a platform for people to meet, connect with each other, and form social bonds. Really extensive research in the US across 100 cities where they scored parks based on quantity, quality, how large they are, if they provide enough activities, found that in places where the park score was higher, people were more connected, cohesive, and resilient than in cities where these scores were lower. So this, shows that if we provide open spaces proactively, there can be less polarization and less social impact, isolation impacts on our community, well-being, mental and physical health, also contributing to costs saved in the end. We also need, this is very obvious, we all know, we need public open spaces for our environment to safeguard our existing environment, safeguard our fauna and flora, but we also need them to mitigate our increasing impacts on natural disasters like urban heat and flood. 2017 UNSW study showed that the estimated cost of air pollution-related deaths in Australia, the cost unit is 11 to 24 billion a year, and thermal stress results cost about $8 billion in lost productivity. So there's lots of costs for not providing open spaces. So we either provide the money upfront in delivering them, or we pay tenfold at the other end when we don't provide them. So we may as well spend the money in providing open spaces and also enabling our communities to live happy and healthy lives. If that's not enough incentive, I don't know what is. Thank you, Phoebes. With so many benefits, direct and indirect, many agencies have a role in delivering and the responsibility to ensure that our open spaces exist now and into the future. And that ranges all the way from planning, could be strategic planning, could be detail planning, all the way from designing, master planning, delivery, all the way to management and operations. And this is across all scales. Could be district, could be regional, could be local. And this responsibility sits with across many partners from state government, local government, and developers who could be private or public developers. And this applies for all open spaces from, that could be used for different functions like active, passive, formal, and informal recreation. So we all have to play an active role in this together to ensure we have enough open spaces into the future, not just now. But all of that is easier said than done. There are many, many challenges that our industry faces in planning for and delivering open spaces. So we thought we can talk about just a select few today. One thing we're increasingly seeing is when we're planning for new areas or when we're planning for renewal or increasing density in urban areas, we start with everything else. We start with housing, we start with transport, we start with many other things, and with whatever space is left over, we see how can we fit open spaces in. And that is a really big challenge for ensuring that there's adequate open spaces into the future. At the same time, we're also assuming that there's existing capacity in local and neighboring public open spaces. But the truth is that in many of these areas, especially inner city urban areas all across Australia, there's very limited capacity to even cater to existing community, let alone any future growth. So we'll not just be not providing new open space, we're also going to be taking away that equity from existing communities, which will not be a good outcome in the long term. But what's holding all of this back? Everybody wants to do the right thing. The actual challenge is that there's limited land, and what land is available, the cost is very, very high and prohibitive. And we focus on feasibility rather than human impacts, the way our planning system works. And therefore, we've sort of shot ourselves in the foot a little bit in being able to enable and plan for and deliver this. The other increasing challenge we're seeing is that even when we do plan for open space, they're either very small pocket open spaces, pocket parks, and really small open spaces, which end up being a maintenance burden for councils or the agency who manage and operate them without actually delivering much benefit to the community. And I think these are practical challenges. The larger, more strategic challenge is that we're not really rethinking our residential buildings or any of our buildings really to respond to changing densities and living conditions for the higher density living that we're sort of, driving in that direction. So we're not really rethinking that. Thanks, Phoebe. But we can start thinking differently and also acting differently. Largely over the past couple of decades or past couple of 100 years, we've been drawing on Europe largely for planning and delivering open spaces. But our neighbors in Asia have been planning for open spaces in high-rise settings for many, many decades now. And there's many lessons we can learn from them in how we can be a little bit more creative and innovative. And we thought we can share some examples from this with you today. Thanks, Phoebes. Site-based planning does have its place. We have been using site or precinct or small area-based planning for open spaces, largely even in our high-growth areas. So in these situations, so let's say there's 4 precincts being planned next to each other. Let's call them A, B, C, and D, because why not? Precinct A relies on the open space in precinct B. Precinct C also relies on open space in precinct B. Precinct D also relies on open spaces in precinct B. And these documents don't really speak to each other. And what that would result in the future is a significant under provision of open spaces. And that won't be incremental significant under provision. That's exponential significant under provision. And those are situations we want to avoid into the future. So what we do need to do is to plan for more strategic and regionally cumulative growth into the future. And drawing on Sarah's recent trip or exploration in Shanghai, Shanghai plans for where regional infrastructure should go into the city first and plans for housing growth around it. So there's lessons to learn there from not doing it the other way around. Thank you, Phoebe. And quite often now, we prioritize access as a primary metric to open spaces. That is a very, very important metric, but we're often using it as the only metric. So which means what it's inadvertently doing is delivering really small, undersized open spaces or are retaining the undersized open spaces in our network. but these spaces don't really offer many diversity of activities to the community or don't allow them to be used in many ways. What a meaningful direction is to amalgamate these undersized open spaces in strategic locations to create more larger and more usable open spaces so our current and future community can use them in different ways. So these are some innovative ways where, we don't have to keep acquiring larger open spaces, but we can amalgamate but provide more value and use. Thank you. And this is a bit more innovative and interesting. Many countries are mandating or regulating that when you have development, you have to compensate for the ground floor area or the ground floor open space at a podium or a roof level and make sure the building design is in such a way that it can be accessed from the ground level. So the examples you're seeing here are from Japan. The last one is from Seoul, where on a podium level, they have an urban pinball machine where you can take your own ball and play on the podium, which would really excite me. And the example in the middle is the new Namnagu Library in Melbourne, where this is a rooftop open space, but very easily accessible through the lift from the ground floor, but also access the outdoor open space for the library at a roof level. So there are many ways of making sure that the open space gets compensated on a higher level and not losing it altogether. This is another favorite example of mine. These are void decks, and all of these things that you're seeing are examples from Singapore, where in residential development and sometimes in commercial development, the building actually starts at the first floor. So all of the ground floor is permeable and sort of stilts like you're seeing in these photos. And across these many buildings, they all serve different purposes. Some are used for art. In the examples on the right, you can see there are outdoor recreation facilities, playgrounds. Some are used as green spaces, and some for community recreation. So these are ways we can really rethink our high-density buildings to include more communal recreation areas. I acknowledge that there's lots of governance and management things for us to figure out in enabling for this to happen, but a worthy pursuit nonetheless. Thanks, Phoebes. And this is something Australia has started making strides toward, but we can do this, much better into the future as well, as leading and allocating appropriate government land that could be, pre-industrial utility land, transport infrastructure land, that, wherever it's appropriate for public open space recreation and use. So we're sort of maximizing land that exists and unlocking spaces that aren't really available for public use now. And lastly, we absolutely must work across agencies and industries to speak the same language. I feel like we've done that now, especially in a few things like a need for more housing. So we all understand, the importance of it. So we also have to align our thinking where quality and well-located public open space is not a nice to have, it's a must have, and start taking really bold decisions to make sure we provide them into the future. Thank you, Sarah. That's me.
Thanks.
Back to you.
Thanks so much, Abby. That was really inspirational. And there's so many things we can do with a bit of collective action. I'm going to hand over now to Esther and Greg, who are going to take us through some really practical ways that we can get more public open space for our communities that are a win-win for everybody involved. Thanks, Esther and Greg.
Thank you, Sarah. Hello, everybody. Now, we all know governments across the country are keen to focus new housing delivery in established areas, or what we call infill areas. And this is because the infrastructure is already established, the road and transport networks, water and sewer, parks and public spaces. So it makes sense. But can you just keep adding people? I'd like to talk to you about how we go about creating the conditions for win-win, focusing on the infill context. The greenfield context is another beast. Perhaps that could be the next Cred Education seminar. Transport. Let's start with how we plan transport infrastructure. I think you agree with me that infrastructure and planning can create value separately and together. So if there is new transport infrastructure in an area and the objective is to enable higher density housing, how do we ensure that there are winners all around? The landowners, developers, and the community all win. So we've got to start with how we do it in the first instance. Now, there are two critical issues I'd like to talk about. Firstly, we need to be smart about selecting station locations. We want to choose locations that have the capacity to support more intensive uses so that the accessibility benefits brought about by the transport investment have maximum reach. And you're also getting a volume of people through the turnstiles to pay for the operating cost of the network. You wouldn't choose an area full of heritage items and where lot and ownership patterns are so fragmented that it's impossible to get a development site of workable scale together. So secondly, once the station locations are selected, then there must be careful coordination of land use and infrastructure planning. All the rezoning controls, planning incentives, and any planning obligations, including public open space, must be in place at the same time. Now, to illustrate why these two factors are so important, let's consider the implementation of Sydney Metro Northwest. Now, this is a New South Wales example. Now, in 2012, you'll see on the screen, there's the map of the Sydney Metro Northwest route. 2012, the Northwest Rail Link was announced. A year later, the Northwest Rail Link Corridor Strategy set out to investigate land use and density opportunities all around the corridor. Now, those land use and density opportunities were eventually pared back. And in 2017, there was only a targeted rezoning of some sites. Much of the area was left for low density. In 2019, the first leg of Tallawong to Chatswood of the line was completed. Now, property values had already begun to soar. In 2024, the second leg was completed, Chatswood to Sydenham, that was done. And by that time, property values were turbocharged even further. 2024, state government selected two precincts along the line, Kellyville and Bella Vista, under its Tier 1 state-led rezoning program. By this time, of course, land around the metro stations was very expensive, and many houses were newly built, which meant very tall buildings and very high densities were needed for development to be feasible. Now, this graph shows how demand acted to turbocharge prices along the Northwest Metro. Now, if we look at the graph, the black lines across the screen are your average median house price growth over 20 years, which is 2004 to 2024, in a selection of suburbs along the Northwest Metro and elsewhere in Sydney. Now, if you look, they're all about the 6.5% mark. So 6.5 price growth every year over the last sort of 20 years. Now, the lavender is the more recent average median house price growth over 10 years. So 2014 to 2024. You might remember from the previous slide, 2019 was when the first leg of the Metro, Sydney Northwest Metro, was completed. So average median house price growth in the lavender, you can see that Greater Sydney in the horizontal line over 10 years averaged about 6.6% per annum. Now, there are two suburbs on the right-hand side of the graph, Stanmore and Croydon, not along the Northwest Metro. They were about the Sydney average. But in Kellyville, Bella Vista, Glenwood, Cherrybrook and Chatswood, price growth was turbocharged. They were upwards of 8%, 8.4% in Cherrybrook. Now, bear in mind, this is not a single year, but this 8.4% was sustained average over 10 years. And so this is what happens when demand is increased because of an amenity uplift, and we do not enable sufficient supply at the time. There is only one outcome: prices will be turbocharged. And so the consequence of this is that the cost of land is then much higher, making it expensive for developers, which means high densities are needed, for public agencies to buy land and deliver public spaces. So in this example, much of the value created has flowed to the incumbent landowners. Higher density and public spaces needed to have been planned and coordinated at the start. So what needs to change? If there is to be significant high density development, the rezoning controls and planning obligations must be in place at the same time. Not rezoning and coming back later to try and get greater density in public spaces after the fact. The Victorian government has recently put out on public exhibition the draft structure plans for a number of suburban rail loop stations, along with a public benefit uplift framework. Now here, additional floor space is available in identified locations for delivery of public realm improvements, strategic land uses, things like commercial and research floor space, and affordable housing. Now, there is some debate about whether there is a business case for the suburban rail loop. However, the integration and coordination of planning and infrastructure here is a smart move. So we want to create the conditions for a win-win. And win-win is by design, doesn't just happen. We have to design for it. Now, the top graph shows us conceptually the value that is created from infrastructure and planning separately and together. So on the left, if there was no planning change, and on the right, if there was planning change. Now, the little purple bits represent an amenity uplift flowing to the property owner from the transport infrastructure. The place is now more accessible. There is an amenity uplift. The peach on the right-hand side is the planning uplift if there is a change to planning controls. Now, if the land was rezoned with no requirement for public infrastructure, the value will be entirely the landowners. Now, the bottom graph shows how the value that is created can, by design, be distributed to the community. The amenity uplift in the purple is retained by the property owner still. Now, some of that planning uplift in the peach is also now enjoyed by the community, which is now indicated in the bottom graph in the beige. So this win-win by design is not just for new transport infrastructure, it also applies to precinct planning and rezonings. If we can ensure that development enables not just housing and built form, but also public spaces for existing and new residents, importantly, this will be a win-win for all. The landowner is better off than before, the developer gets to make a profit from the opportunity, and the community receives some of the value that is created. Next, Greg will talk to us about how a win-win by design could look like.
Thanks, Esther. I want to talk to you today about a model scheme. It's not being tried, it's being developed in my head, but it comes from experience in dealing with renewal areas and the high cost of land, the prohibitive cost of land. Now, what I'm going to talk to you about is about consolidating land to achieve public benefit outcomes in a high accessibility precinct. Now, this is not a novel or new policy idea. It's done across Australia. I know in New South Wales, for the planners in our audience, key sites is a method to achieve public benefit outcomes provided by the developer. But this scheme is a bit bolder. It requires more discipline for the planning authority and a bit more work for the developer. It requires the council or the planning authority to focus on the specification of the public open space. The specification of the outcome it is seeking, and then let the market find and then assemble allotments that will accommodate both the park and a viable housing development. So could we go to the next slide, please? So I want to talk to you through a case study, and Esther will come in later and talk about the dollars and the numbers. The location I've so what this is about is street block park and housing scheme, creating homes and parks simultaneously. And the case study I've chosen is a 1.1 hectare site, about two or 3 minutes walk from a rail station with access to the city, approximately 30 minutes from the centre of Sydney. By road, it's about 20 kilometres from the centre of Sydney. It's in Narwee, and its zoning is R3 residential, which is not the base zone for dwelling houses. It's a step up. It's more or less a townhouse zone, but there's hardly been any townhouse development in this particular area. And New South Wales viewers will know what I'm talking about when I say a TOD area, transport-oriented development area. It's not one of those. These are declared by the government in recent times, and it's not an LMR area, so it's not a low and medium rise area, but it is a railway station. So that's the context. It's 1.13 hectares and it's 18 lots. So when I said before this is a bold scheme, it's deliberately so because what we're about is trying to internalise the provision of open space on the development site. So if we go to the next one. So in the top right corner, you can see a simple graphic of the intended outcome. Basically, the site is assembled, or the different lots are assembled, either by a developer or someone acting in the interest of the owners. We'll go through the process in a few slides, but that's the concept that it's a 1.1 hectare site, 5,000 square metres, which is an optimal size for a local park, as I understand it, is the target for the planning authority. The residual site enjoys the floor space transferred from the park site, and a development is to take place that can be viable. On the left-hand side is a summary of different incentive scenarios. So if we allow a 2.5 to 1 floor space ratio on the site, we can get 269 dwellings on the site. That's going from 18 dwellings to 269. The other, you can see the other results of other FSR targets, and Esther will talk to the financial outcomes of each of those scenarios. So, enabling a park within a consolidated suburban site, as Esther said, we have to have the rezoning controls, that is the planning incentives and the planning obligations in place at the same time before anything happens. Developer pays an appropriate price for the land. Landowners receive some of the windfall gain, and the community receives housing in an accessible location and a park. Next, I'll hand over to Esther. She can talk you through the economics of it.
Thanks, Greg. I think Esther might be frozen. Esther's frozen, and I'm not sure I can talk through the economics of it. Is there anything you can add?
I can probably do it. So, convincing landowners to sell to a developer, it ain't easy. And I can perhaps sense out in the audience there, some people saying 18 lots, contiguous lots, he's dreaming. But it's all about the offer, what is available now as an opportunity compared to what the incentive that is provided. And I think in planning there's a resistance to having grand plans and having large consolidations because it takes so long. We'll come back to this. If Esther, is she available?
Here she is.
I'm back.
Hi, Esther.
Am I back?
Yeah.
All right, thank you.
Oh,
Esther, could you explain the economics of this particular
Okay.
example?
Am I back? Can everyone
yeah,
hear
you're
me?
on, Esther.
Yeah, you're there.
Very good. Okay, so continuing on, let's look at some numbers using the same example. On the screen, the houses in the street block that Greg just showed you in the previous slides. Now, those are what some of the houses look like. They're your regular suburban blocks, 600 to 800 square meter blocks, market values 1.8 million to 2.5 million. So let's say on the left-hand side, you can see their house values. Let's say there's an average value of about $2 million per house. Now, if a house can sell for $2 million at auction, a landowner would expect more than $2 million from a developer. So the developer is effectively competing with the value of the existing use. And of course, some landowners will have no interest no matter what the price. So the table on the left shows us what stamp duty would be for a replacement property and a notional 20% incentive on top. Now, this would then arrive in the right-hand side column at an average price for each landowner, each house owner, 2.5 million, which is about a 500,000 premium over what the houses are worth. The next slide shows us, though, what can a developer afford to pay, though, for a development site? Well, that depends on the development potential. The table on the right shows different densities. So if the site was rezoned to a floor space ratio of 2.5 to 1, a developer could afford to pay, say, $45.5 million, which would average $2.5 million per house. So that would pay for stamp duty and give the landowner 20% sweetener. At the highest density of floor space ratio of 3.5 to 1, the developer could afford to pay $66 million, and the landowners would receive average $3.7 million. Now that's a $1.7 million more than what the houses are worth. Now, if planning obligations are not in place when planning change is made, in this example, the value created flows to the landowners as a windfall gain. Big win. If a developer secures a site that is capable of the highest density of 3.5 to 1 FSR for $66 million, development would be feasible and the developer would make a profit. The developer has a win, but the community receives no public spaces. All right. So this demonstrates the case for why we must do things differently. The graph shows a distribution of value to the community now in the beige color. If by design, planning obligations are in place when the planning change is made, the value that is created can be distributed between stakeholders. If we look at the table down the bottom, the value created is directly related to how much density is permitted. Now, at the lowest density, the first row, there could be nominal public realm improvements worth about $1 million delivered as part of the development. At the bottom, highest density, there could be a park and some other win for the community, could be affordable housing. So this situation demonstrates this is a win-win for all beneficiary stakeholders, landowners, developers, and the community. And so Greg will now talk to us about how we could go about rewarding public benefit.
Okay. What I wanted to do was to go through the process in detail. I've got a little flow chart. If we go to the next slide. As I said, this is different, this process, from a traditional planning process. Planners don't have a mortgage on or supreme knowledge on where to best put these facilities like local parks in a transit-oriented centre, a transit-oriented development centre. So we've turned it on its head a bit, and I'm interested in what people have to say about it. So it's called a street plot park and housing scheme. And what happens is the planning authority specifies the criteria for the site, the floor space ratio, maximum that will be acceptable, and particularly the park. So the park has to be, say, 5,000 square metres, 2 or 3 street frontages of 50 metres plus, that sort of thing. Then expressions of interest are called for qualifying super sites, as I call them. These street blocks or parts of street blocks. It doesn't have to be the whole street block. Developers and or owners consortia submit EOIs. Successful EOIs announced. DA for each park and housing scheme hopefully submitted and approved. And then it's a matter of the scheme super site is cleared, development constructed, and the park facility is either dedicated as a clean remediated site or as in its embellished state in accordance with a specification again provided by the planning authority. And the apartments, of course, are sold or leased or dedicated as affordable housing by the developer. It's at that point the scheme is completed. And a point I wanted to make in conclusion, before we talk about the win-wins, it's different from the traditional approach. And going back to where we started in talking about the community getting back some of the value uplift. In the traditional approach of rezoning and adding value to land through planning mechanisms, value uplift happens when the site master plan is approved or endorsed by state government or a council. So it happens well before the rezoning event, often, and it also happens again at rezoning, and it happens again at the time the incremental DAs on each individual site are approved. With this approach, value uplift is deferred until the scheme is approved. And the other important thing to note is that the development internalises the provision of the park as part of the development. We don't get this double handling of the developer paying a contribution of money to the council and then the council going off and finding a park somewhere, and the price in between the time they've got the money and they've found a park or parkland, if they can find it, the price has ballooned and they can't afford it. So, in conclusion, the win-win that Esther was talking about, landowners receive some of the capital gain, but not all. So value uplift sharing. Developer, of course, has to make a profit. The community receives more housing opportunities in accessible locations. This particular example, we showed on one slide that a 2.5 to 1 development increased housing by 10 times in one go. Existing new residents receive a new substantial local park at no cost. That's all I wanted to say, I think. What's the next one?
Thanks, Greg. So thank you to all of our amazing speakers for some really big picture industry shifting thinking. It really is time. We can't waste any more about how we're going to build these incredibly healthy communities that benefit so many people and really practical solutions. And we really open up the floor to questions in just 1 second to have a chat with you about some of the challenges you've been facing, because we work with lots of the people on this call and we know the challenges you're facing. But look, let's all say it together. Public open space is essential, critical infrastructure for our individual, collective, economic, social and cultural wellbeing. Change is going to take leadership and collective action, not just from government, but also from consultancies, from private sector, and from communities who are already standing up and asking for more public open spaces in their growing communities. We can't just continue planning on a site basis, but where we are, there are practical solutions, and we need to be planning upfront and making sure that those controls are in place at the very beginning of a process. We need to be incentivizing, people to deliver public benefit. Right now, sometimes there's really no incentive to do it, but we're still allowing all that uplift. And we can create conditions for win-wins for landowners, developers, managers, and communities, from site amalgamations through call-outs for open space to ensuring we are proposing homes that we can also deliver the public open spaces, schools, community facilities the people needs in their home. And I think that the conversation of schools and open space is another one we could have a whole education webinar on as well. Well, we've got a few minutes now for questions. There's only one or two in there. We're really open to answering your questions now. You've got some real experts on the floor for 15 minutes. Throw things at us. One of the first questions that we received is something that I think I've been hearing for my 20 years working in open space planning, and that is around, what do you think about the 2.3 hectare per 1,000 people benchmark? I mean, what an old chestnut that is. I think the message is
Sarah?
we have to think differently. And Greg, I'll hand over to you in a second on a contributions approach to this. Every place is nuanced, and the way you plan for open space in every place is different. It is really important that we have standards that we strive to, and we need not to be afraid of them. The reality is you're probably never going to meet a benchmark or a standard, but it doesn't hurt to have one. And we know that people have been crying out for a standard of some sort. With the standard you would set in an urban high density area is obviously going to be different to the standard that you're going to set in a greenfield area. But I think there is a real desire for people to have something to enable that negotiation, particularly councils who are really, it's a really hard job to go out there and negotiate with development teams and other agencies around getting the open space their communities need. Greg, from a contributions perspective, is there anything you wanted to add about that?
Yes, I do. Many years ago, the open space planners said quantity is a useless measure. We have a quality-driven or a needs-driven plan for open space. That wasn't quite right. The 2.83 hectares per 1,000 is useful in the sense of working out in a greenfield area a rule of thumb in terms of the amount of land that has to be, should be generally made available for public use for open space. It's of little or no use in established urban settings. As you know, Sarah, we have the situation of the local park, which is what I was focusing on for the transit centres. That's ultra important for fresh air and meeting people and walking with your kids. What about the open space that's a district level, like ovals and active recreation? We haven't dealt with that today, but there's a specific way ways that has to be dealt with. And you can't deal with it the same way in infill as you can in greenfield.
No, that's right, Greg. And I think that, what we're really missing is that regional plan for where those big public open spaces to go, because nobody's going to put those on their sites. So unless we've got that strategic direction that aligns with those housing targets that are being set, it's just going to be incredibly challenging to deliver what we need. So that big picture leadership and strategic planning is really needed in practical ways, not just in spirit and intent. Esther, over to you for a question. Sorry, Abby, did you want to add anything on that one?
Yeah, sorry, Sarah. Thank you for the question, Aditya. Just from a target and benchmarking perspective, I know lots of councils we work with also sort of struggle with this. What should be a minimum standard for an infill site, which is very, very different from a greenfield site? 2.83 hectares, let's be honest, lots of urban areas don't already meet the 2.83, right? So there's no point in trying to aim for 2.83 into the future, but there's lots of other targets or benchmarks as well. There's benchmarks where you can maintain current levels of provision. There's benchmarks where you can have, access to large, sizable open spaces, not just any open space. Targets to say there's enough diversity of open spaces, and targets to say that the recreation activities offered matches the community's interest and it can evolve over the future. So 2.83 is a target, but we can set our own targets to see, what is achievable, but is also a good outcome for the community.
That's right, Abby. Planning is nuanced, as we know. Probably why we don't have a standard across the states or Australia. Esther, you talked about some really interesting approaches around, getting controls in place up front and changing the way we plan. What are some of the challenges or some of the barriers you see to this shift, or that you wanted to talk to about?
I spoke about the creating the conditions in two contexts. One, when we're planning for new transport infrastructure, we've got to pick select the station locations correctly, etc. And of course, the rezoning and planning controls all need to be in place at the same time. But it equally applies to where there's no new transport infrastructure. It's just precinct planning and just new rezonings. Fundamentally, I think the problem is probably a lack of awareness and probably the lack of coordination. It's difficult. So if you've got new transport infrastructure investment, the transport agency delivers it, and the transport agency is influenced by engineering considerations, etc. Not necessarily land use suitability. They may consider it, but it's probably not front and center where the station locations are selected. They've then got to work with their planning agency colleagues. And so that's a big coordination task. And then when it comes to precinct planning, it's probably a lack of awareness and probably also a coordination task that is difficult, because you've got to develop a process and not just to have it as an afterthought. So I think it's a combination of factors, from a lack of awareness to the big coordination task that, maybe no one's been able to crack, that's really stood in the way.
Yeah. And Esther, I think it leads into lots of the things that we were talking about, and also a question from Mitchell, which is, how do we think we can best change the political will to push for more public open space, or at least see the preventative benefit of public open space? New South Wales and other states seem to be doing great things, but over in WA, I feel like there's simply no appetite. And I think it goes back to leadership. It goes back to changing the language. All of us sit in meetings and we hear the same kinds of messaging at us all the time. So maybe that shift in messaging has to come from all of us around, no, this is too important. This has to change. What can we do together? I don't know, Abby, if you've got any thoughts on that one.
And I think you hit the nail on that, Sarah. We always hear, land is too high value for providing open space, and it should probably be sold off to make other benefit or for delivery of housing. We need to bake in that lexicon and language to say nothing is more high value than open space for the benefit it provides. And if all of us sing from the same songbook, I think the political will have no choice.
Thanks, Abby. Esther and Greg, question for you both. It's around the street block park and housing scheme, working in small metropolitan LGAs, but it might be a maintenance burden for larger regional LGAs. Yes, there are costs to not providing the open space, but when council cannot afford the immediate burden, there is no incentive to shift. It may be that we need to designate certain precincts close to centres for this type of scheme. I like the idea in principle, but to Esther or Greg, do you have any thoughts on that?
If I can go first.
Thanks, Greg.
The scheme is predicated on it being within, say, 1 kilometre of a transport-oriented, like high frequency transport. But beyond that, that's it. The specification is just to say the parameters of the park you want, the size, the minimum dimension, street frontage, and let the market find that site which can be developed and provide the park to specification. The reason why that's important is to let the market do it is because it is damn hard to assemble so many blocks of land in a reasonable time. And so if you've got holdout owners, which you inevitably do, if you just have a kilometre radius area, the developers can and the site assemblers can go and talk to other people who where they can get a site together. Esther?
All right, Esther, yep, over to you.
I don't have much more to add beyond that.
Thanks, Esther. Hey, Jonathan, Carl, hello to you, and thank you for your question. What is Sarah's favourite open space and why? That shifts all the time. It used to be Burwood Park, but I just came back from Shanghai and now it's People's Park. And I just can't stop saying how incredible to have a city that has a People's Park and a People's Square and a People's Station right in the center of the city that every single person can use, that has seating in every possible location, that thinks about things like where you can hang your coats and your bags while you do your Tai Chi class in the morning, that has shelter and space and beauty and bird noises. That's my favorite new park. I'm blown away by it. If you get a chance to go over and see it, I would recommend it. What about Abby, in favorite park?
Ooh, I feel like I've said this lots of times in lots of either webinars or meetings, so people are bored of it. But this English Park in Randwick, which has this really amazing playground, and the reason it's my favorite place is because I've watched it for 5 years from my window, and how much it, the users changed from the morning till the evening. All these different cohorts, from young children going to school to mothers and their babies with parents, intergenerational uses, all the way to it being used by young adults at night and really drunk adults later into the night. The ways that the playground and the district, I guess because of the interesting infrastructure it provided, it just allowed for so many uses for so many cohorts, and that's why it's my favorite. Thanks, Sarah.
Thanks, Abby. And it raises another interesting question around how management of open space, how open space is management in high density apartment blocks, and how strata influences the use of those spaces and the usefulness of those spaces. I think another education we could bring some real experts into on that one. I don't know if Esther and Greg, we've got a couple of minutes left, 30 seconds or less, favorite park? Why? Or you can leave it with us.
My favourite is one right near where I live. It's called Laxton Reserve. I've actually got a little video of it if I could share it. Would you like me to do that?
Not right now. We can share it afterwards in the email, Greg. We'll flick it around to everybody. I love that idea.
Right, I'll do that.
But 3 minutes left. Here we go. There's Mark Taylor. The key discussion point may be making greenkeepers and parks workers essential workers like nurses, police, fire. We are losing our community clubs too. Right on, Mark. I'm so with you. That was another big thing. We hear a lot about small government, but you know what? Having big government means you've got lots of lovely maintenance workers working in those parks and looking after these important public spaces. I think we're going to have to wrap it up, everybody. That was a really fantastic conversation. Esther, Greg, and Abby, thank you so much for all your thoughts and insights, and everybody who's been on the call today. So many of our friends from across the country. We really loved having this conversation with you, and please reach out to us anytime. We love talking about public open space, but mostly we love talking about how we can get really great benefits for all stakeholders. You can talk to me or Abby at Cred, Esther at Atlas, or Greg and all the others at GLN. We're a friendly bunch, and we've been doing this a long time, and we really care about outcomes for our communities. There's a short feedback poll. Please fill that in. It really helps us to create really great educations. We love sharing our insights with you. We want to make this industry the best it can possibly be. So please send us your thoughts, send us your ideas for our educations, and we're really excited to see you at the next one. Thanks, everybody.